Hello, my writer friends. Welcome to Write with Intent with Mindee Arnett, where I talk about all the tips, tricks, and nifty little ideas that I've learned about how to write good stories, to get them published, and to have a career as a writer. Today, on this very first video series, we're going to talk about where to get your ideas. So let's get started. So one of the most common questions that I get, and I know a lot of my other friends, writing friends, get, is where do you get your ideas? It seems to be the thing that everyone wants to know. And they kind of treat it like ideas are these really cool things that you just find hanging on a tree, or when you're walking in the woods and you find a baby doll that somebody left behind 20 years ago, like that's kind of how it works. And it's a really difficult question to answer, and one that I know most writers don't like to answer because it's really, really not that simple. I mean, unless you're, Stephanie, whatever the woman's name is that wrote Twilight, my mind is blanking. Stephanie Myers, that's her name. Forgive me. Unless you're Stephanie Myers and you're dreaming about sparkly vampires, most of us just don't get our ideas that way. So one of the useful things that I have learned along the way as far as cultivating ideas is that this theory that's out there that talks about if you need two sticks to start a fire, you need two ideas to start a story. And I find that's actually very true. So taking that metaphor a little bit further, let's talk about how starting a novel and coming up with an idea that actually goes from start to finish is a lot like building a fire. If you're like me, especially when I was first starting out, and like a lot of other writers I know, you'll get this really cool idea for a story, and then you sit down to write, and you might write a couple of paragraphs or a couple of pages, and then eventually it just fizzles out and it doesn't go anywhere. It's a really common problem. And one of the reasons why it happens is because generally you only start off with one idea and you actually need two ideas. And in reality, you're going to need multiple ideas. But let's break this down a little bit. So the metaphor I'm working on right now is this idea of the fire triangle. If I can figure out how to do it, I'm going to flash a really cool thing on the screen, maybe over here, maybe over my face, that's going to show you what this triangle looks like, or you can just Google it if you would prefer to do that somewhere else. But basically, there are three components that you need for every fire. You need fuel, heat, and oxygen. And if you want to stop a fire, interestingly enough, you have to eliminate one of those three things. Not that it has anything to do with writing stories, at least not yet. Anyway, so if we're going to take this metaphor a little bit further, instead of having oxygen, fuel, and heat, to start a story and to complete a full novel, you're going to need what I call spark, character, and conflict. Now, the spark is really that two ideas theory, this idea that, you have one really cool idea for a scene that could start a story for you, but you don't know where it goes once that scene is over. So that initial spark is that initial idea, that kind of the hook, whatever is dragging you into the story. And then then what you need is an idea to mix with it in order to get the spark. So to give you an example on what I'm talking about here is that I like to use films because I think films are a little bit more accessible. There are so many books and so many of us have not read the same books out there, but we've seen a lot of the same movies. Now, one movie in particular that works for this metaphor is Home Alone. Now, when I think about Home Alone, I imagine that the writers had this really cool idea about Home Alone, leaving a kid that gets left behind on Christmas, which sounds like you could make a pretty cool story out of it. However, if you sat down and tried to write that, you would eventually have that same problem where you would run out of it wouldn't go anywhere. So in order to have a story, you need to add in that other stick, which in the case of Home Alone is the burglars. So as soon as you add the two of them together, boom, you have a spark, you can start the story. So novels work the same way, is that, you need to have something in addition to your initial idea to get it. The cool thing about ideas is that there are many, 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 many of them, and I have a feeling you probably have a lot of them already. If you're like me, you see something and you're like, oh, that would be a cool story. So for example, because I'm always asking myself when I'm out about, what if or why is something the way it is? And the example I like to give there is I'm from Dayton, Ohio, and one of the things we have is Marion's Pizza, which is we're famous for, and it's really good. And if you ever visit, please check out a Marion's. Ask for the old grill or the old brick oven, because it's the best. Anyways, I digress. So the cool thing about these Marion's Pizza is that all of them are built without windows. So they have fake windows when you're sitting inside, but you can't actually see out of the windows and nobody can see in. And it's kind of an odd choice. And so when I asked myself, well, why would somebody build their pizza joint without any windows? And my answer that I came up with is, well, it must be the mafia and this is their hideout and that is a perfect place for them to have meetings and the cops can't stake outside and so on and so forth.
Leave the gun. Technique can only.
And that could be the start. It could be one stick in the start of your story. And the cool thing about ideas and the sticks that you need to start the story is that they just have to simply be what I call combustible to you as the writer. And this is very, very specific to who you are and what the kind of stories you like to tell. So for me, my sticks tend to be anything to do with magic, fantasy, spaceships. I like rogue characters. I like, really empowered females that like to kick a lot of ass. Anything along those lines is going to do it for me. And I tend to have themes that I go often and come back to often. And then there are ideas that don't spark for me at all. Like, for example, I am not ever going to write about terminal illnesses. I'm not going to write about the Holocaust. I'm not going to write about zombies. I'm not going to write about fashion. Like really anything that happens just kind of in the real everyday world just does not spark for me. Like I'm not going to get a fire started out of those ideas. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're thinking about where to start the story and how you want to start the spark. But let's take it a little bit further and talk about how... So you have your spark, which is, like I said before, is kind of the situation. It's kind of the hook. And then you have to have the most important part of your story, which is the fuel. So, fuel, kindling, however you want to talk about it. This would be in the fire metaphor, the logs that are laying on the ground. And then you have to go fetch the logs and put them into the fire and start the fire, and it's going to burn for a long time. This is what gives your story longevity. It's going to allow you to reach novel length, or if you're just trying to do a novella or a short story, the size of your log or quote unquote logs is going to be the length of your story. So things that can go into this pile would certainly be your characters. So their backstory, their ghost, the journey that they're going to go on, what they have to overcome. And it's going to be, just all those elements that are part of the story itself, the story structure, kind of the events that happen. And that's one part of it. And then the other part, the oxygen part, which is incredibly important, is what I would call conflict. So conflict is what keeps the fire going. And it's what literally, not to make a pun, but it's what fans the flames. So you need to set your story up to have conflict in order to keep progressing. Okay, so hopefully by now you're getting kind of the general idea here, about you got to have these elements to even consider writing something of novel length. And the tricky part, though, I can sit here and tell you those things, but is how do you find them and how do you put them together and how do you get past that dreaded first paragraph and get yourself down to writing these stories? So all I can tell you is what works for me, and maybe it'll work for you. So again, the idea is to start off by picking ideas that are combustible to you as a writer. Again, no zombies for me, no fashions, maybe zombie fashions, but probably not. But something that gets your interest going, and you're like, man, I'd really like to write a scene, or I'd like to write about that character. It can be any of those things that kind of gets it going. Now, sometimes the spark, which with like lighting a fire, you can light a fire in multiple ways. And if you've ever done it, you at least have seen it on TV. You can do it the really hard way, which is rubbing the two sticks together if you're stuck in the middle of the woods and lost and hoping to be rescued, which takes a lot of effort. I've never actually done it, but I imagine it does work in theory, I would hope, or the movies have lied to us. But regardless, it's a lot of effort, and therefore maybe not the easiest way to start a story, but it can happen. And another way would be to use a fire starter, so where you have fire steel and flint and you rub them together and you get the spark and then the kindle catches and it's really awesome. Or you can start a fire the way my husband does it, and he's a firefighter and he likes to just pour a whole bunch of fuel, actual gasoline or igniting oil, I'm not sure what it's called, and then he just throws a match on it and whew, we have a fire. So any of those work, and you might get lucky, and sometimes you'll get a story idea that is like just throwing a bunch of gasoline on the fire. and you have a story that just has what we call legs right from the beginning, and it just takes off, and you write your merry little heart out, and you've got a book 12 weeks later. When that happens, thank the writing gods, because it doesn't happen very often. And if it doesn't happen for you or never happened, don't despair. You can create ideas the old-fashioned way by rubbing those sticks together and putting effort into it and mining it. And I want to give you an example, a real-world example of how this works. So after writing one of my recent series, Onyx and Ivory, the book had done really well, better than any of my other books that I had sold before. And I had come up with an idea during the time of writing that duology for another fantasy. And it was this most perfect, beautiful idea. I loved it. I just loved the story, and it came out like I just talked about. I wrote it very quickly, and everything was smooth, and I just had a jolly old time writing it. And when I finished, I felt fairly certain that my publisher, my editor, was going to love it as much as I did, because it came out so great, and it was so easy to write, and I loved the idea. And my previous books had done well, and usually if they've done well, they want more books, so on and so forth. So anyways, after finishing that novel, we submitted it to my editor for consideration as my follow-up to my Onyx and Ivory series. And probably 6 to 7 months goes by and we don't hear anything. And then finally, my editor comes back with a very big, sorry, I don't love it. You've done better. Give me something else. Ouch! So, needless to say, after I, doused my finger-cutted fingers in a bowl of lemon to make myself feel better, I got over it. And I set the book aside and the idea aside to maybe come back to someday when I am ready, over my heartbreak, and decided I needed to come up with something else, because they definitely wanted another book from me, but it had to be the right book. Well, so much easier said than done. So without any heart or desire or any true compassion or whatever, I came up with the idea for what ends up being my upcoming novel, Riven. And the way this idea came was I was very deliberate about it. It's a lot like that rubbing the sticks together. It wasn't easy. I had to try, and I had to dig, and I had to go find the logs in the woods and unearth them from, a bunch of grass and weeds and thorns, and bring them back to the fire and throw them on there and eventually get this story started. And the way that happened was that I again went around and picked up ideas that were combustible to me and then randomly combined them. So the first idea that came to me, there's a video about Iceland and about the last name daughter in Iceland. You can go to YouTube and query it. It's really, really awesome. There's some crossfitters in there that I admire, and it's all girl empowerment. And you watch this 2-minute video about what it means to be a daughter, and you will just, if you're a girl anyways, you're going to walk away, ready to be the next Wonder Woman. So I really loved that idea, and that got me looking at Iceland and just kind of the Icelandic culture and their naming, the way they name in Iceland. So they don't use traditional surnames very much. They actually will name you after your father or your mother. So if you're a daughter, you will become the daughter of your father usually, I'm sorry, it's not usually maternal, it's usually paternal. But anyway, so their last names don't line up, which is incredibly confusing, but so romantic and fun. And I really love this idea. And I said, I want to write a fantasy that has the same kind of naming convention in it. And then I started looking at Iceland itself, its history, the land itself, the fact that the center of the island is uninhabitable for the most part because there's these huge ice glaciers. And I started asking myself, well, why in my world would this island not be inhabitable? And of course, the answer is magic, because everything needs to be magic, and so on. So that was the first part. It was one idea, but certainly not enough to write a whole novel. So I just kind of kept looking and searching and trying to find combustible ideas. And one night, my daughter and I introduced my daughter to an old 80s movie called Can't Buy Me Love, starring a very young Patrick Dempsey. And it was one of my favorite movies growing up as a kid, and I wanted my daughter, who's around the same age I was at the time I watched it, to check it out and see if she liked it. And I still love the movie. It holds up really well, and it has the premise of, if you haven't seen it, of a boy who pays a girl to be his girlfriend so that he can be cool, which doesn't sound like it would have anything to do with a magical island that's uninhabitable in the center, but I love the setup. I love the idea of this guy that has to pretend to be this girl's boyfriend. And I started asking myself, well, why would I have a character that needed to do this pretending? And out of that came these ideas for what eventually became Riven. And I'm happy to say that after working on the proposal and the opening chapters, that my editor and publisher were happy with the book and they decided to take it. So what had started off as a horrible experience became, honestly, I just finished writing the book not too long ago. A wonderful experience. And although I had to work a lot harder for that idea, the story was not something I loved less because of it. Like, even though it wasn't like that last story that was like, throwing the fuel on the fire and the big explosion, it was still valuable and still worth it. So I think, that is probably the biggest thing to remember when you're writing stories, is that we tend to think that they have to be this romantic, inspired. The muse is hitting us over the head with the fairy wand and all the pixie dust is falling down in order for art to be legitimate. And that's actually just not true. It's not true. It can be something that you construct very deliberately and with a lot of intent, which is kind of the idea behind this whole series, is that you can be very intentional about writing your stories. I think that the only thing you have to remember is that they need to be combustible to you, and that you need to think about the fact that you can't just stop with the two ideas. You've got to find the logs, you've got to find the character and the conflict. Especially the conflict is probably the most important piece at least in order to make your story readable and enjoyable and to have legs, quote unquote. So that's kind of that's my suggestion on where to get your ideas and how to go. And just to full disclosure, this is my very first attempt at creating a video. I'm probably very awkward and not nearly as humorous as I hope I am. And that's okay. So if you hated it, let me know. If you loved it, let me know. And most especially, if there's anything in particular you would like me to talk about in an upcoming video, let me know down in the comments or send me an email at Mindee Arnett at mindeearnett@gmail.com. I love to hear from you guys. I want to be able to share content with you that is valuable and that's going to help you go from wherever you are in your writing journey to wherever it is that you want to be. All right, guys. Thank you. Remember to write with intent and live with intent. See you next time.